Hey there, welcome back to our Human Resource Management series. Today we're going to talk about selecting the right applicants for the roles that we've opened up and recruited for. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so let's jump into selecting and testing job applicants. So first of all, the purpose of the selection process. Now, on one hand, it's pretty obvious, but there are some details that are worth bearing in mind. First of all, it contributes to the organization's bottom line goals. After all, we're hiring people to reach strategic objectives and organizational goals. We need the right skills and the right people to reach those goals. It ensures that the organization's financial investment in the employee actually pays off. It's actually very expensive to hire and train an employee, so you want to make sure that that investment pays off. Next, it helps fulfill hiring goals and quotas specified by the affirmative action programs the organization has in place. Next, it minimizes the litigation risk of people suing, saying that they were passed over or rejected based on discriminatory practices. Finally, it helps hire and place job applicants in the best interest of the organization and the individual. You want a happy organization and you want a happy individual. You'll want both. A good selection process is going to help you do that. Now, as has been the case in many of our videos so far, there are certain contexts that we need to take into account when hiring. We're going to look at the organizational context of selection, the job context, and the applicant context. The organizational context of hiring looks at, well, what jobs are available, what the job situations are, what legal constraints are in place, organizational characteristics, management philosophy, and the organizational culture. In other words, all the aspects of the organization, both internal and external, something we've discussed before, that come together and culminate into a selection environment, if you will. So just to give you an example, available jobs and job situations, there might be many available jobs, but there are certain legal constraints about who you can hire for that job. I'll give you an example. Right here in Utah at this time, there are many jobs for MAs, medical assistants. I mean, they cannot find enough medical assistants. So, available jobs, many. However, you need to have very specific qualifications and what's the term I'm looking for? Certifications. You need to have specific certifications to work as an MA. So you can't just say, oh, look at all these MA jobs, I'll go apply for one. You need to have those certifications. There's a legal constraint. Then we have the job context of the selection process, meaning the conditions of the job pressure, qualifications, expectations. Some people can handle certain jobs better than can handle other jobs. My father once told me when I was working in the corporate world, he said, yeah, I never really could deal with all that corporate nonsense. That's why I started my own business. But you have what it takes to succeed in the corporate world. You can handle that. The thing is, though, it might have sounded like a compliment, but it really wasn't. He was telling me that I was a sellout. But that aside, he had a point. It takes a certain disposition to work in certain jobs. So that's the job context of the selection process. Now, one thing to bear in mind there, for the selection process to be successful, the applicant must have a very good understanding of the job and the work conditions, what he or she is getting themselves into. If this is not done, then it will affect the applicant's ability to get settled and be productive in the job. So if you don't have a good understanding of the job context and you do not hire and select against that understanding, then there's a really good chance you're going to have a mismatch, and that's no good. Finally, we have the applicant context of selection. This is when we look at the knowledge, skills, and abilities, often called the KSAs, and other predictors used to determine how successful an individual will likely be in that job. So in other words, okay, we understand the context of the job. We understand what's necessary and what is going to be a good predictor of success. We now need to measure how well a job candidate has those attributes. Okay? Yeah, we get what the organization needs. Yes, we understand what the stress of the job is. But do you have what it takes? That's what we need to measure. Because ultimately, the knowledge and skills that the applicant brings to the table will help HR place the person in a position that will most likely result in the success of both the individual and the organization. Remember, we want both. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's look at selection criteria. When we are selecting people, it's important that we do it right, we do it well, we do it scientifically, and that our selection process is both reliable and valid. Now, let's talk about these terms. Reliability means consistency or stability of a selection process and criteria, meaning that the criterion does predict the success of an applicant. Yes, we measure this. We feel that it predicts success. Yes, you're right. It's a reliable predictor. Validity is how accurately and precisely a criterion or measure assesses an attribute. So one way I like to look at this is with this graphic, right? So let's say that we're trying to predict the success of an applicant, and our measures are both unreliable and invalid. This means that if we were shooting at a target, for example, our shots are not tightly grouped, so we're inconsistent, and we're not evenly distributed around the bullseye of the target, meaning we're not even aiming at the right thing. On the other hand, let's say that we're unreliable but valid. That means that we're not tightly grouped, so we're inconsistent, but we're evenly distributed around the bullseye of the target, so at least we're aiming at the right thing. The opposite of that is if we're reliable but invalid. This means that we're tightly grouped, so we're pretty darn consistent in our shots, but we're not evenly distributed around the bullseye of the target, so we're not aiming at the right thing. What we want in our hiring process is reliable and valid. We want to be tightly grouped, meaning we're very consistent in our selection process, and evenly distributed around the bullseye of the target, meaning we're aiming at the right thing. So that's what reliability and validity mean in selection. So with that in mind, let's look at some selection instruments. Of course, you all know resumes and CVs. Well, maybe you know resumes. You know resumes. These are mostly used in business and industry, whereas CVs, curriculum vitae, these are most often used in academia. They're much more in-depth, they're longer, they're more detailed, all that nonsense, but both serve the same purpose. They are documents that allow a hiring manager, for example, to quickly get an idea of what kind of applicant you may be. Then we have interviews. Now, interviews are really useful for gathering factual background information and so forth about candidates, but the thing is, they're really not that good at making assessments because they are highly subjective. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about in a future video are biases that come into play when we're doing performance reviews. Well, these biases that we have not yet discussed, but we will, can come into play during an interview process as well. And so it's really not a very good predictor of performance. Well then, why are they so popular? Because we think we're better. We think we're unbiased. We think we're good judges of character. We think we can mitigate for our own biases and exercise great insight into looking into the soul of a candidate. We're not. We're just not. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that we are going to abandon interviews altogether. Let's face it, they're a mainstay of the selection process. One thing, though, that is pretty popular right now and does help mitigate somewhat for the biases, although not much at all, but a little, are behavioral interviews. This is when we ask applicants to answer questions about their past performance in a given work situation. So, for example, if you've ever been in an interview and they asked you, tell me about a time when you were working with a team and you could not come together on a decision and people were starting to exhibit some infighting. What did you do and what was the outcome? These behavioral interviews always kind of start with, tell me about a time when, and end with, what did you do and what was the outcome? They want to see how you handled workplace situations. They often are focused on soft skills such as communication, critical thinking, problem solving, teamwork, leadership, things like that. Now, another selection instrument is a work simulation. This is when applicants perform under an actual work condition so the employer can better understand how they do the job. So, for instance, when I interviewed to become a faculty member, one of the things that the hiring team required of all the applicants was basically a demonstration, a little teaching demonstration, about 15-20 minutes long on a scheduled day in front of a classroom. I called it the Dog and Pony Show. It's an opportunity for the whole hiring committee and a variety of other people as well to actually see what your teaching style is like, how you perform in the workplace. This would be considered a job simulation or a work simulation. Another work simulation that I've used in the past when I was hiring is giving the applicant a business problem and then asking them to solve for it. So, for example, one time I was hiring a web developer, and so I sent all the applicants a really crappy website. I mean, just heinous. And I said, okay, develop a wireframe, basically a series of mock-ups. Develop a wireframe that will show me how you would redesign this website. So when I got all these in, I could see who really understood website design and architecture principles versus who was just kind of self-taught and winging it, someone like me, right? So that's another example of a work simulation. Then, of course, we have background checks. You're going to, check to make sure that they're a human being and that they've kept out of trouble. That's standard. But this is the one that I wanted to say for last, and that's reference checks. Reference checks are kind of the unsung hero of the selection process. They are better than you may suspect. It's really great to be able to talk with somebody who has worked with that person in the past. Now, let's be clear on something. You've probably heard, and it's true, but let's talk through it. You've probably heard that, well, gee, you're really not allowed to say anything if somebody calls you for a reference check. So if I'm hiring Linda and I call Linda's previous employer, you've probably heard the previous employer can't really say anything. Well, they can't say anything bad. All right, they can't say anything bad. So if Linda's previous employer says, oh yes, Linda worked with us from June of 2009 to April of 2019. So yeah, she was with us for about 10 years and she's eligible for rehire. And that's it? If that's all the manager tells you, steer clear of Linda. Because the manager is kind of telegraphing to you, I can't say anything, and if I could, it probably wouldn't be good, and so on and so forth. But here's the thing. You are totally allowed to tell the hiring manager good things about the person. That's completely permissible. And so if I call Linda's previous manager and say, hey, I'm kind of looking at Linda, they can gush. If they start gushing, oh, Linda's phenomenal, fantastic, this is the work she's done, tell us a little bit about what you're hiring her for. Well, we want to do this kind of position. We're looking for somebody with this skill set. Oh, Linda can totally deliver there. She did this, this, and this for us, and that sounds pretty similar to what you're looking for. She needs a little bit of development help here, so if you can provide that, she's really going to excel. I totally recommend her for the position. They are allowed to do that. And if you get that kind of referral or reference, then, oh my gosh, you're totally set. True story, I one time was hiring somebody. I called a previous employer, somebody for whom the candidate had done contract work. So it was temporary contract work. I called that previous contractor, I guess, and they said, oh, whoa, is he in the market? And I'm like, well, yeah, he's applying for this job. Seriously? Would you happen to have his updated contact information? We could really, yeah, well, they didn't say we could use it, but it was really, really, really clear they wanted to hire him out from under me. So I hung up on that call pretty darn quick and hired the person, and it was a phenomenal hire. So I just want to put in a really good, strong reference for reference checks. Because at the end of the day, we need all the tools we can get to make the very best decisions when we're selecting from our pool of applicants. And I want you to rely on the ones that work the best and mitigate for the ones that work the least. Do that and you're going to be in great shape. All right, so there you go. Now you have a little bit better idea of everything we go through to select the very best candidate from our pool of applicants. I hope you enjoyed. Stick around. There's a lot more to go over. Have a great day.